What is up, YouTube? My name is G3 Iron, and today we are taking a look at resistances. We're getting started today by taking a look at the mitigating elemental and chaos damage sources and why that matters, and what ways and numeric values elemental and chaos resistances impact your gameplay and your survivability in Path of Exile. Be sure to give us a like, a subscribe, and hit the bell for more notifications about videos just like this one. So what are resistances in Path of Exile? There are two types of resistances, two major categories that you can break up resistances to in Path of Exile. The first is elemental resistance, and the subset of elemental resistances are fire, cold, and lightning. These are damage sources throughout the game. Both you as a player can interact with, or monsters in the game can interact with to inflict this type of damage upon you. So when you are reading an item or a passive tree or a particular discussion where somebody is maybe giving somebody else some advice on how to boost their elemental resistances, this is what they're referring to. They're referring to one of these three, or all of these three, or some combination of these three elemental resistances: fire, cold, and lightning. Can't tell you how many times I'm interacting with new players and they get caught up on this. So if you're new to Path of Exile, don't feel bad that you're getting caught up on this. There are these two macro categories of damage, negatable damage sources in Path of Exile: elemental and chaos resistance. Now, chaos resistance, you might be wondering, what the heck is chaos resistance and why isn't it elemental? Well, it's a special type of damage. Those of you who are veterans, you're familiar with this. That chaos resistance bypasses energy shield. So energy shield builds that simply seek to survive by stacking energy shield instead of stacking life. Chaos damage bypasses energy shield and hits you directly in your life. So it's a special kind of damage. It's different from elemental resistances, elemental damage sources. And so because of that difference, it's got its own separate category for its own type of resistances. So the mitigation forms and ranges that occur are between -60% to 75%. So oftentimes when you hear people talking or giving advice, oftentimes you'll hear me giving advice to newer players to make sure that their resistances are, quote, capped. That is referring to the 75% mitigation number on your elemental or chaos resistances. So if somebody says, Iron, what do I need to do to improve my build? And you've got 25 fire resistance, 50 cold, and maybe like 73 lightning resistance, the first thing I'm going to do when I'm looking at a build like that is say, you need to cap your elemental resistances, because that's going to be a great source of frustration for you. That's why you're dying a whole bunch. And this is, again, where a lot of new players make some mistakes, either after they first kill Kitava and take a resistance penalty, or after they kill Kitava the second time and again take a resistance penalty, where it's really, really tough. The game is pretty difficult in dealing with resistances when you're first getting started out in the game. So that is a tip, a trick. If you are just here as a new player and you were just wondering what resistances were and what you could do to immediately improve your build, cap your resistances. Get them to 75 as soon as possible. You can check that in game by opening up your character profile. C is the default hotkey for linking and opening up your character profile screen, and then click on the defensive tab and take a look at your elemental resistances. See how close you are to 75% and whether or not you can craft for yourself or purchase an upgrade from somebody else to get those elemental resistances as close to the cap as possible. Now, why do resistances matter in Path of Exile? Well, quite simply because they mitigate damage that's coming in. So I'm not going to get into all of the numbers on this. Simply look at the number at the bottom, right? The ratio, the damage ratio between a character with -60% resistance and a character with 75% resistance that are hit with the same amount of damage is, here's the ratio, and the end result is 6.4. So that ratio is the difference between somebody that's got -60 resistance and 75% resistance. That's a massive swing when you start adding in some zeros behind it and factoring in all of the different damage sources and damage types that are coming at you. Imagine for a minute, as soon as you interact or encounter a pack of enemies in Path of Exile, if all of them are hitting you and they're all doing, let's say every single hit is doing 6.4 times the amount of damage to your character as what they could be doing, that's a lot more damage than you would ever have to deal with, and your health pool is going to reflect that. You're going to die a whole bunch. So one way that your health pool, whether that's energy shield or life, can become more effective is if you cap your resistances. That's a little bit of the numeric breakdown. By the way, sourcing this is directly from the POE Wikia. So where can you get resistances from? What are some sources of resistance in Path of Exile? Well, no shock here, the passive tree, bandits, and items. So those of you that are wondering, where on the passive tree can I locate and find resistances? This is presently the 3.5 passive tree at the end of Betrayal League, right before 3.6 Synthesis League. This is a hotbed of nodes that interact with the word resistance. So these are both offensive categories that are going to mitigate or penetrate mobs, bosses, and enemies' resistances, but there are also several different passive nodes that give you all sorts of different types of resistances, whether that's elemental resistances, fire, cold, or lightning, or chaos resistance, even included being the rare pepified chaos inoculation, which is up here in the top right form of the passive tree, which chaos inoculation does something really awesome. It means you don't have to invest anything into chaos resistance because your maximum life becomes 1. So people who take chaos inoculation are called CI builds, and they typically stack energy shield because their life pool is going to only be 1 no matter what. Your life pool becomes 1. Your maximum life becomes 1, and you are immune to chaos damage. So you never have to worry about mitigating chaos damage if you take chaos inoculation. And there's a couple other items throughout the game that can do this as well. But these are the general hotbeds or hot zones located on the passive tree that interact with resistances. Lots of great places where you can simply go out of your way for a couple of passive points and shore up your build there. Another option is the Bandit Lord Alira. She gives a bunch of flat mana regenerated per second, a bunch of global critical strike multiplier, and then she just gives 15% to all elemental resistances across the board. I'm not going to get into all of the debates about whether or not Alira is the right choice for you. I'm simply going to note that if you are following a build guide or creating your own build guide, one of the factors that you need to take into consideration is what would you do with the additional passive points that you would have, because if you kill all of the bandits in Act 2, you get 2 passive points. What would you do with all of those passive points, those 2 passive points, versus what would you gain from taking on or working for one of the bandits? So if you work with Alira, that's at least an option for you to have 15 all resistance across the board for elemental resistances. Notice that she doesn't say all resistances, which would include chaos resistance, all elemental resistances, meaning it's 15 to fire, cold, and lightning. All right, the third place that you can find resistances is, of course, on items. So here is a gold rim that we just simply took a stock photo of. It gives you a percentage amount of all elemental resistances between 30 to 40%. It is a very, very popular leveling helm. You see that it's a very low level requirement, and so a lot of people, as soon as they can get their hands on, especially during a new league, as soon as they can get their hands on a gold rim, they get one because oftentimes it fixes a big chunk of your elemental resistances. And even when you think about it, looking at endgame, when you're sitting past both kills of Kitava, where you would be at negative 60 all resistances, well, if you've got a perfectly rolled gold rim, or even the worst rolled gold rim, that's going to mitigate your resistances and bring you up to negative 30 as opposed to sitting at negative 60. So that's a great source for one item. That's a great source for upping your resistances, for upping your elemental resistances across the board. So what's the big deal about capping resistance? This is an exceptional post. We're going to take a look at this exceptional post in extended detail right here. This is a post by the Whitesushii. Okay, so hey guys, Whitesushii here. In this post, I'll be covering the concept of getting more maximum resistances and why the stat is so desirable. In a way, I will also prove that maximum resistances matter a lot more when attempting to hit certain one-shot thresholds rather than actually mitigating consecutive damage, which in turns translates to bossing versus mapping. Okay, so I want to point something out here. This post is over a year old. The archive post is, of course, linked down below in the video description. So if you want to do all of the wonderful math that Whitesushii does, or if you want to check it, you can do that there. But what I want to talk about here, just really quickly, is the concept that he mentions here of being one shot versus mitigating consecutive hits. So really, really quickly, if you get one shot from something and you can mitigate the total amount of damage that you're taking in one big massive hit. So let's say one big massive animated attack from a boss, like what often gets used in these discussions is the Shaper Slam. If you can mitigate that one hit to the point to where you do not die and you're able to recover for whenever the next hit comes in. That's what he's talking about mitigating one-shot thresholds. Whereas when he's talking about mitigating consecutive damage, what he's going to be referring to is, let's say you get into the middle of a pack of enemies and there are several different damage sources hitting you all at once. Yes, you can have higher resistances in those scenarios, but you won't necessarily be able to recover as quickly, and so therefore this is why it's a distinction. Having more elemental resistances matters in a greater sense for the one-shot threshold and surviving versus trying to mitigate consecutive hits where you might not know how many consecutive hits you're going to be taking in a consistent period of time, and so it's really tough to gauge and to math out those factors of how many hits you can take before you're going to die. That being said, this is the section that is very relevant to our discussion, talking about maximum resistances. There are ways in which Path of Exile you can go over the cap, and Whitesushii goes into some of those methods. Some of those methods are actually going to be outdated because this is a year old, and Path of Exile development team Grinding Gear Games has recently changed the way how flasks work. It used to be that flasks in certain elemental categories simply gave you additional maximum resistance, which they changed that because it was absolutely broken. One of the most popular videos that we've had here on the channel over the last couple of years has been an immortal build that showed off, featuring just how broken those flasks can be, where a character essentially made themselves immortal to elemental hits and elemental damage by capping themselves through the use of flasks. So GGG changed that. They nerfed those flasks. That's why we don't have those flasks anymore, is because of builds like that one and people taking advantage of flask effectiveness. So in light of that, now that we don't have, essentially immortal builds floating around, the question actually still becomes very relevant. How important is it to get additional resistances past the cap? So you might think of that cap at 75% as being a soft cap. It's a cap that is going to total all of your elemental resistances across the board, and then anything over 75 isn't going to count towards mitigating damage that hits you immediately. However, there is a way to go over this, and there are several different mechanisms to go over this. Like I said, flasks are one way that they've gotten nerfed out of the game, but there are several different passives on the passive tree that interact with maximum resistance, which I believe there's one up here for lightning resistance is what it is. Yeah, I believe energy or unnatural claim gives you +1 to maximum lightning resistance. There's another one, I believe, for fire. Maximum fire resistance, I believe, is somewhere. Yeah, it's over here on the left-hand side. It's called barbarism. That gives you +1 to maximum. And then there is, of course, one for cold as well. I'm not sure exactly where on the tree that is. Of course, it's going to be on the right-hand side. One for each side of the tree. Survivalist, which gives you +1% to maximum cold resist. So you can get this on gear, you can get this on the passive tree, and then of course you can also interact with it through flasks in a semi-nerfed fashion with the way how mitigation works with flasks now. So what's the math of all of this? Well, Whitesushii has done the hard work of doing the math for us. So let's take a look at the Shaper's projectile attack, which according to the wiki deals between 5,639 to 8,458 cold damage and penetrates 25% of cold resistance. So assuming the worst case scenario and the projectile does a maximum amount of cold damage, the resistance penetration does not exist. For a player who has his resistances capped at 75%, he will take, and he does some math for us here, this is the amount of damage that's actually going to be hit onto your energy shield or to your life, is 2,115 damage. For another player who has his resistances capped at 76%, he will actually take 2,030 damage. Now you'll notice that's a significant chunk of damage that's different. It's not simply a 1% difference by upping your maximum resistances. It's not simply 1%. So Sushi gets into it in more detail. Taking 2030, dividing it by 2115, we find that the 1% difference in maximum resistances actually results in approximately 4% of actual damage mitigation. So he extrapolates this. He's got a Google spreadsheet included in this, which you can go and take a look at. That's also linked down below in the video description. But here's the table of what this looks like. If your max res is at 75%, this is how much effective damage you take, versus as you are able to invest more points in your maximum resistance, and this is why you'll see so many players that play hardcore or that are pushing for 100 try to get their maximum resistances as high as you can. Gem sources like the purity gems are wonderful ways to also increase your max cap resistances. You see that the damage gets lowered by quite a bit, by nearly pretty much 4.2% every single time. That's a big difference. It is a big difference trying to squeeze out 500 additional HP in your build as opposed to not having to squeeze out 500 additional HP in your build, because for these one-shot scenarios, you're essentially taking either 2100 damage or 1600 damage. That's a big difference. So he says, I can't really say about whether or not it's worth running a purity or a certain shield, since when it comes to min-maxing, there are many alternatives. Damage to survivability trade-offs and even pseudo diminishing returns. I call it pseudo because unlike increased item quantity, which is hard-coded, this is a little bit theoretical, involved in which will make it impossible to get an accurate gauge. However, there are a few things that we can be sure of. First off, it is almost always worth it to run one of the 3 resistance flasks, since not only do they give you a neat effect, they also give you a 6% boost to maximum resistances. That line no longer applies. Remember how we talked about how flasks got nerfed? This no longer applies. So you can't just run around with 3 elemental flasks on your flask bar and then constantly be going up by 6% up to this 81. You can't do it anymore, and that's one of the things that I wanted to take the time to point out. So if you're a newer player and you are looking at Whitesushii, don't simply go, oh, I just need to go out and fix my flasks, because that's not available anymore. Flasks no longer have that additional maximum amount of resistance. The second thing that Sushi says, spending almost 10 times the currency on a corrupted amulet or body armor is pretty much a luxury choice, considering how the 1% increase only results in a real 4% increase to damage mitigation. Of course, this value is a bit more complicated when it comes to builds like Righteous Fire, where this increase implicates other factors such as life regeneration. Okay, so if you want to read more on this, I highly encourage you to go check out Whitesushii's post. But here's the essential difference. The big, too long, didn't want to math, right? 1% difference in maximum resistances is essentially 4% actual damage mitigation. Does that mean you need to go all out of your way to try and up your maximum resistances past the cap point? Not necessarily, because for the most part, it's going to help you most during these one-shot scenarios. And if you're already surviving during one-shot scenarios, then it doesn't matter. If, however, it will matter for consecutive hits, if it does make the difference for your build to survive through a maximum number of consecutive hits, then that's fantastic. That's definitely worth the investment. So I just wanted to throw that out there kind of as a wrinkle for you to be thinking about as you are either following somebody else's build guide or developing one of your own. All right, so questions for discussion. Let's jump into them. What's the highest resistance capped character that you have, whether that's on standard or in league? What's the top resistance character that you've got? Maybe you're running purities. Maybe it is that you're using these flasks to mitigate more incoming elemental damage. But love to hear from each of you. What's the highest resistances capped character do you have? And then I'd actually like to flip it. What's the lowest resistance capped character that you've ever finished the game with? I know a lot of people out there shotgun bosses, and they just keep rerunning the bosses, and they don't care how many times they die in softcore. So love to hear both angles of that. Also, where do you look to fill in your resistances in your builds? Leave us a comment down below and let us know. Is it items? Is it passives? Is it through a lira? Do you just constantly grab a lira? Do you constantly go out and look for jewel slots to fill in? Are there particular passives that you're looking for, like those maximum elemental resistance passives on the tree? Are there particular items that you really fancy when it comes to increasing your elemental resistances, like Goldworm or like other items that are available? And then when do you notice yourself upgrading your resistances the most? During acts 1 through 4, after the first Kitava kill, after the final Kitava kill, in maps or endgame? One thing that I know stands out for me is typically after I kill Kitava the first time and I transition from Act 5, I just noticed that a lot of the times I die to the fire guys that are in and around the Karui Fortress and along the beach there. I die a lot to them. I often just take a bunch of extra fire damage and I just die a whole bunch. So I noticed that typically that is one of the times where I'm going, all right, I'm just going to go out and upgrade as much of my gear as possible, so that way I don't have to worry about my resistances while I'm leveling until I get to Kitava again. That's obviously the perfect world scenario. It doesn't work every time. Oftentimes you're going to be swapping out gear as you are leveling, but I know for me that's at least a notable time where I go, I'm going to die a whole bunch and fail to level if I don't pay attention to my resistances right now. Leave us a comment down below, and as always, thanks so much for watching, and I hope while you are capping your character today on elemental resistances that today is the day you find a Mirror of Calandra.